Good afternoon. The work of my office is often grounded in numbers, but it would be tragic if we missed the human impact that is reflected in this small box. This box not only represents the rape kit and the evidence that populates it, but it represents the fragility of human life. It represents not just a willingness to volunteer for a process that is excruciating and re-traumatizing in terms of being examined for the evidence that goes into this kit. It reflects something more. It reflects a commitment to justice. And what we've got to make sure, auditors and stakeholders alike, is that we have a system in Kentucky that makes it easier to pursue justice for perpetrators and peace for victims. That's what our findings are about today. We wouldn't be here without Senate Joint Resolution 20, which was sponsored by Senator Denise Harper Angel, who deserves a mountain of credit for bringing this to my attention. We have enjoyed broad bipartisan support of this effort, and from the outset, let me be clear that the outrage that comes as a result of the failings of our current system know no party, they know no region, and they know no gender. They are something. This is something that really does bring a lot of people together in an effort to improve a system for our most vulnerable. Certainly I want to acknowledge the KSAPs for their outstanding partnership, the prosecutors, local law enforcement, the Kentucky State Police, the Kentucky Hospital Administration, and literally numbers of others who have been involved with making sure that we get all the facts we need to not just clear up the backlog, but to recommend a better system moving forward. The result of this count is that the result of this count is we now know that the number of untested sexual assault kits in Kentucky is 3,090. And it's important for a moment to get beyond just the number and to understand that these really do represent the most fragile of human lives. If you'll consider for a moment that when every instinct of self-preservation must surely dictate a retreat to safety and security, volunteering for the process and volunteering for the examination that populates this kit really does reflect a commitment to something far larger, and that is justice. In April, my office surveyed 391 law enforcement agencies in Kentucky, conducted interviews, and held 14 meetings across the Commonwealth to hear from stakeholders such as law enforcement, victims, advocates, prosecutors, nurses, and more. And I want to point out that our mission here in the auditor's office was really twofold. The first was to come up with a specific count to help leverage national and nonprofit resources to be able to clear up the backlog, and that's important. But our effort has also been focused on making sure that we could make recommendations to fix this problem, not just in our time, but for all time, to create a system that makes it easier for victims and for those who are pursuing justice on their behalf. Auditors identified 1,859 untested sexual assault kits in the possession of 87 departments and sheriff's offices, and another 1,231 untested kits at the KSP Forensic Laboratory. It has been estimated that there may be as many as 400,000 unprocessed kits nationwide. As a result of this effort, we now know that our number is 3,090. We join at least 12 other states and several other cities who have begun counting and testing the kits. It's important to count and test the kit because when you are able to leverage the resources to clean up that backlog, the net result is that people who are walking the streets who think that they have gotten away with this crime end up being held to justice. We know that we live in a country where 60 to 90% of rapists are serial rapists, and nearly all of them are serial criminals. Clearing up the backlog is an incredibly important first step, and to the KSP's great personal credit, they've already been awarded an almost $2 million grant from the Manhattan District's Attorney Office to clean up this backlog. The net result of their good work and our coordinated efforts is that there are a number of perpetrators who will be brought to justice. But if we don't get to the bottom of why the kits were not tested in the first place, we're going to be right back where we were 5 years from now, counting kits all over again. I'm determined not to let this happen in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. To that end, my office found a number of problems that have led to kits being submitted to the KSP Forensic Laboratory and not tested in a timely manner. Our first area is law enforcement. Approximately 41% of law enforcement agencies reported that they do not submit all kits for analysis. and most agencies reported that they lack clear policies for handling sexual assault kits. Let me be clear. In a state with 400 different law enforcement agencies and nearly 300 that collect this kind of forensic evidence, there clearly is a need for a model standard so we can have more clarity and more precision in what we expect from local law enforcement. Some of the reasons law enforcement reported for not submitting the kits included a lack of understanding of the multiple purposes for analyzing kits. Troublingly, 11% of law enforcement indicated that they don't submit a kit if they don't have a suspect. This ignores the fact that the National DNA Database, known as CODIS, could help them identify one. 21% of law enforcement surveyed don't submit kits because they suspected the act was consensual. But testing unanalyzed kits in Cleveland and Detroit has resulted in many kits from non-stranger assaults identifying serial rapists. A whopping 91% of defendants ID'd in Cleveland, a whopping 91% of the defendants ID'd in Cleveland's effort to clear its backlog are serial rapists. We now know that not only are most rapists serial rapists who would rape strangers and acquaintances both, but they are serial criminals committing other violent crimes, domestic assault, burglary, and more. As a result of these observations, I recommend law enforcement be required to submit all sexual assault kits for analysis within 10 days of booking them into evidence. I also recommend more and better training for law enforcement, that law enforcement adopt policies for dealing with sexual assaults. It's heartened to hear near unanimous sentiment from law enforcement that they would prefer to submit all kits, and that many of them were already beginning to update their policies to improve the handling of sexual assault investigations. Folks, it's important for me to point out at this time and place that there is nothing in the system that should overwhelm us, given that I've been absolutely heartened by the amount of commitment to all the stakeholders in the place. And let's be clear, victims and their advocates, prosecutors, law enforcement, the KSP are all committed to the pursuit of justice. What we have to come up with is a system that makes it better and easier for them to do their job, that makes it easier to pursue justice on behalf of victims, that brings peace to victims and justice to perpetrators. Most tellingly, we've had issues with the State Crime Lab, and I want to speak for a moment about the degree to which we have managed scarcity after 10 years of economic difficulty in Kentucky. What it has forced is nearly every agency to get in the business of triage. Perhaps no area has it been more felt, the triage that is, in the area of public safety. And I want to point out for a moment that public safety is foundational to any notion of good government. When we go about the business appropriating and building our budgets, certainly they ought to reflect a commitment to making sure that those stakeholders in the public safety space have adequate resources and able to do their job. Sadly, that has not been the case. We have seen a significant increase in the demand for forensic evidence at precisely the same time that resources to law enforcement agencies have been diminished. The CSI effect is something that almost every member of law enforcement speaks to, and that speaks to, because of how popular these crime shows have become, now many juries require a heightened level of forensic evidence in order to come back with a guilty verdict, which has substantially increased the pressure on the State Crime Lab. And let me say this about the State Crime Lab. While frustration with the amount of turnaround time from the State Crime Lab has been consistent, praise for the professionalism of the people who work there has been uniform. Clearly what we have is a crisis of resources. And if we're going to reform the system, we have to make sure that the resources are there in place to guarantee that that investment is having a good impact, not just for those in the public safety space, but for the taxpayers who pay the freight. Auditors in my office found that long turnaround times to analyze sexual assault evidence, as well as confusing communications from the forensic laboratory, also contribute to fewer kits being submitted and tested. The average turnaround time to analyze sexual assault evidence submitted in 2014 is currently 8 months, and data indicates that this turnaround time is increasing. This is unacceptable. One prosecutor, for example, shared a case in which a woman was drugged and raped and could not identify her rapist. The analysis matched the profiles of 3 men who remained in the community for 8 months while the kit was awaiting analysis. Far too many rapists are walking the streets while the evidence needed to put them behind bars is collecting dust. A lack of adequate resources is primarily to blame, preventing the laboratory from paying forensic biologists a competitive salary and purchasing the equipment it needs to expand its capacity. The CSI effect, as I have mentioned earlier, has resulted in the explosion in demand for forensic evidence. Ohio increased its investment in its lab and found ways to increase efficiency. It has reduced its turnaround time to 20 days. But Louisiana underwent a massive efficiency effort, eliminated wasteful steps, reduced its turnaround from 400 days to 60 days. Folks, there are models of good government that can be adopted here in Kentucky, but we have to understand that we have to do things differently. One of the things that we need to do differently is we've got to get away from a culture that says it makes sense to pay folks with a biology degree $32,000 to work in the lab. At that point, they get an investment in training that is worth $100,000 at least coming from the taxpayers, and often they're lured to private laboratories or other states where they can make significantly more. It makes a lot of sense for us to make the investments that we need to make in our laboratory to make it easier for prosecutors and law enforcement to do their jobs, to make it easier for victims and their advocates to bring peace. I want to be clear that in Kentucky, reform is a precondition for building a system that truly works better for victims and those pursuing justice on their behalf. As part of its efforts, Ohio also studied the cost of not funding the lab. As it turns out, it is an investment we cannot afford not to make. One criminal alone cost the public nearly $10 million in tangible and intangible costs with all the crimes he committed in Ohio. That man ended up murdering a police officer after raping a woman whose kit was ignored. I strongly encourage the legislature to find ways to increase funding for our forensic laboratory. Public safety is the foundation of good government. And I like to say that if you spend a few minutes with someone's checkbooks, you can tell what their true priorities are. And let me be clear about this. In the digital age, no politician can claim the mantle of being tough on crime without fully funding the state crime laboratory. As we traveled around the state, literally thousands of miles, taking hundreds of hours of testimony from stakeholders in the system, it became clear that there were other issues that were impacting the process. And I want to caution for those of you covering this, it's very important to review this system as a process that begins with a victim presenting to a healthcare professional who performs the rape kit, to the many steps that lead, hopefully, to successful prosecution of a perpetrator. Let me be clear. 98% of rapists will never spend a day in prison. The process that goes through to collect the rape kit is so invasive and so re-traumatizing that the FBI report that only 8% of rape allegations are false. We're talking about an incredibly intrusive process. We're talking about a process that's also necessary to make sure that we can begin the process of getting justice. The importance of a sexual assault nurse examiner to this process cannot be overstated. In Kentucky's 112 emergency rooms, we only have 249 licensed sane nurses serving a population of nearly 4.5 million. That is insufficient, and it is unacceptable. We don't have enough people making sure that base level of care is performed with compassion and commitment on the front end. And if you truly view this as a process, you have to know that it takes a long time. And whenever there is an interruption, a fit or a start in the system, that represents an opportunity for a victim to fall out of the process. And it's impossible, nearly impossible, for prosecutors and local law enforcement to bring justice to perpetrators without the active participation of a victim. So making sure that we have the system in place that begins with sane nurses. So we're excited about working with hospitals and those that represent them and others in the healthcare profession to make sure that we have a more sufficient network of sane nurses in Kentucky. We ought to model a sane readiness program on the stroke readiness program that we've had in Kentucky's hospitals for now almost 6 years. Making sure that we have an abundance of sane nurses is incredibly important to making sure that we can have a system that delivers justice. and understanding that doctors often don't want to perform the exams. We heard anecdotal information about while taking testimony about doctors and nurses trying to refer victims to other hospitals, about doctors who refuse to provide the care. Folks, that's illegal, and we need to make sure we have a system in place that better communicates the full responsibility that every stakeholder has at every point in this process. I am deeply concerned about the untested kits, but I'm equally worried about the evidence that is never collected because victims are not treated with compassion and respect in their darkest of hours. We need standards of care at hospitals, SANE-ready designations, similar to the stroke-ready designations that we already have, to incentivize hospitals to have more nurses and have a better network of providing care to our most vulnerable. So what do we do next? I have already briefed the leaders, the chairman of the respective judiciary committees, in addition to Senator Denise Harper Angel. There are a number of recommendations that are found in our report that are going to require legislative support. We all have a lot of skin in this game. We all are reflected and committed to doing the right thing on behalf of victims to create a system that is more just. But we're going to have to work together in a bipartisan fashion, not only to make sure that the reforms that are recommended in this report take hold with the legislature, but to also make sure that as a result of implementing those reforms that we're in a position to fully fund that which must be done. And let me be clear, that which must be done is a system that works better for victims and their advocates in the pursuit of peace, that works better for prosecutors and law enforcement in the pursuit of justice. We need to beef up the Victims' Bill of Rights, tighten laws to prevent kits from being destroyed, streamline the process, clarify our communications, and to make sure that we have more sane nurses. I want to point out to you that the challenges outlined in this report are dwarfed by the commitment to justice from victims and their advocates and from law enforcement and prosecutors. We will reform and rebuild this system, and we will demonstrate for all time that victims truly do matter. Thank you very much. I'll take questions.
How much funding is needed?
Jack, our assessment, ultimately this is going to be a decision made between the appropriators in the legislature and the folks at the KSP Crime Lab. But our first assessment is it would take $3 to $5 million in the first year of the next legislative session, and it would take $2 million in recurring cost after that. But let me point out, we have allowed the scarcity culture to drive too much of what we've done in state government for the last several years. And we can't use a lack of funding as an excuse for not getting things done. And I want to be crystal clear in my belief that in this time and place, when DNA has replaced the fingerprint, as in the importance of law enforcement being able to do their job, there is not a politician in this town or any other that can claim to be tough on crime without fully funding the state crime lab.
You mentioned getting a count was important so you can leverage national and nonprofit resources to try to address that fact. What do you mean by that?
What we mean by that is, as a result of getting this count, and one very good example is the KSP put together a terrific grant application that was coordinated with our efforts in this area, and got a $1.9 million grant from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City to clean up the backlog. That will enable them to take this now identified backlog off the back of the state crime lab and pay to have them privately analyzed, which will then allow us to compare the forensic evidence gathered and now tested there within, and to put that on CODIS, which is the National DNA Database, criminal database. As a result of that, we'll see a number of hits. In Detroit, where they had a backlog of 13,000, I believe that they have cleaned up 3,000 of those kits and now have identified potentially 100 serial rapists. It's a big deal.
Did you notice anywhere around the state that it maybe had more of a concentration? Obviously,
Sure.
population-wise, you're going to have more, but did you ever notice any areas of the state that were problem areas?
Sean, I would point out to you two things. One, this is not an issue that only impacts urban areas. It literally touches not only every part of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but every part of the United States. Make no mistake, Kentucky's numbers here are reflective of a larger national scandal into the backlog of unprocessed rape kits. And what it is our hope, and what's my intention, is to make sure that there is a Kentucky solution to what is truly a national tragedy. And by working together and by making sure that the crime lab is fully resourced, by making sure that the communication that's occurring between local and state law enforcement is clear and concise, by making sure that we communicate that there's no politician who can claim to be tough on crime in the digital age without fully funding the crime lab, we can demonstrate real reforms that demonstrate real value to the regular people of this state. But you'll see bigger numbers in our urban areas, but that's where an increasing number of people live. Cleaning up and clarifying policies and procedures, folks, is really important, because the smaller the agency is in law enforcement, the less resourced and skilled and equipped they are to deal with these sorts of issues. We heard anecdotal information while taking testimony about smaller districts not even knowing what to do with a rape victim, much less with a rape kit. These are things that have to be more clear, more concise, and we've got to have a system of better training to guarantee that the information and skills and knowledge that we need be available in every jurisdiction in Kentucky.
Is a breakdown of the numbers by law enforcement agency publicly available?
Yes,
right
and it's in the report, and we'll be happy to discuss that with you later.
How far back do some of these go? I think it indicated some went about far back as 1970.
We do. We have some that have gone very far back, and this underscores my point about why we've got to clean this up once and for all. Folks, this isn't the first undertaking that we've seen to try to clean up the backlog. The Submit the Kit effort that was implemented 10, 15 years ago really had a great deal of success. But here we are just a few years later finding ourselves with a new backlog. I'm not in the business of solving problems just so they can come unsolved. And I think the legislature, the stakeholders, and my office have a very important role to play in here to make sure that we solve this problem, not just for our time, but for all time.
Adam, is there more hope for victims to come forward? I mean, if they know this stuff's going on, they know, maybe from people they know or whatever, it takes weeks, years, nothing happens, they go through this invasive thing. The fact that this is out there now, and hopefully, it gets back, that this will help victims and to come forward. Maybe right now they don't because of, concern about things going on for you.
Don, I think that's a key point. I think the second greatest beneficiary of this effort will be people who are trying to put their lives back after it's been shattered by a sexual assault. I think the biggest beneficiary of this effort are folks who regrettably will become victims of this crime. Because what we know is that 98% of rapists will never spend a day in jail. We know that the number of false claims is less than 8%. We know that in this system, and you have to think of it as a process, it's so important that when there are fits and starts in the process, when there are needless breaks, when there are elements of it that take far too much time, we lose victims in the process. And I think what we have to build in its place is a system and a process that recognizes the fragility of the victims. Because these are folks who have survived what I view as perhaps the worst possible crime. It's something that doesn't leave you, that stays with you all your years. And in order to bring peace to victims and justice to perpetrators, we have to have a system that works better and more along the lines of some states who have done this more successfully than have we.
Does the Attorney General's office have any responsibility for reviewing these cases or trying to get these kits tested? Does any of the blame?
Well, certainly I think there is blame that falls everywhere. But one thing I would point out is the Attorney General made a recommendation a few legislative sessions ago to fully fund the crime lab through the CLEP fund. And the point of the matter is, I think that if we had had a more fully funded crime lab, that we would be in a far better spot than we are now. So I want to be clear, this isn't about trying to gore anybody's ox or trying to assign blame. This is the very important work of evaluating a system to try to understand its underperformance and to try to make recommendations based on the collective knowledge and wisdom of people who are in the space every day to build a system that works better for law enforcement, for prosecutors, for victims and their advocates.
Is this a cultural problem? The fact that these kids have sat untested for so long, and still some are still in the custody of these agencies that have never even sent them.
It is a nationwide cultural issue. And I think one of the things that we have been able to successfully do here is raise this as an issue And this is an issue that is so foundational to good government, because at the end of the day, the purpose of government, one of the fundamental purposes of government, is to ensure the public safety. And, you know, I'm not here to criticize the Kentucky State Police or any of the people involved, but because of the scarcity mentality in Kentucky, where we have been dealing with a lack of resources at precisely the same time that we've seen an increase in need, we've got to figure out new and innovative ways to do things. And there clearly have got to be reforms, but those reforms have to be funded. We have recommended that we have a mandated turnaround time of 90 days. But the crime lab can't do that tomorrow without additional resources, and that's why it's so important that we make sure they have the resources to do their job. Because, again, what we've heard in every corner of Kentucky was a high degree of appreciation and respect for the commitment and professionalism of those who work in the state crime lab. But what we hear just as much is a frustration with the lack of resources enabling these people to do their job.
Will you update this number?
Absolutely. I mean, we're committed to one of the recommendations that we've made, and the Kentucky State Police, as a result of getting the grant, is they've had to put together a stakeholder work group that will do, among other things, monitor their own performance. So that's incredibly important. And moving forward, you know, one of the things that is so terrific about living in Kentucky, and this is an area that may be in Senator Harper Angel's district, if not just near it, is that we are a global logistics hub. We have the best and brightest minds in the world managing very large logistic companies within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. To me, moving forward and making recommendations and implementing recommendations for how to handle this logistical system is incredibly important. And why we wouldn't go out and ask the best and brightest to help us with this is something that would make little sense to me. And then I'm going to be aggressive about making sure that we reach out to stakeholders, but also people who have expertise in things like logistics to help us improve the system.
You mentioned increased funding of 3 to 5 the first year and $2 million recurring. How does that compare with what they're currently getting?
Well, it's we can share those budget numbers with you now. I think what everybody is keenly aware of is that there have been a significant, like every other agency in state government, the Kentucky State Police have had to deal with a budget that isn't giving them the resources to meet the needs that they're confronted with. So this would be a significant increase, and it ought to be directed precisely to the crime lab so it can impact the issues that we've identified here.
That brings up another blame question. The Senate Judiciary Chairman, Whitney Westerfield, is blaming the governor for not presenting an adequate budget.
Well, that's up to Senator Westerfield. We're going to have a lot of time moving forward to build the system to put it in place. And I think pointing the finger of blame ultimately isn't helpful to the outcome, because let's be clear. People who are drawn to be cops or prosecutors or troopers are people who have the pursuit of justice written on their DNA. It is absurd to think that any of these people aren't spiritually committed to the pursuit of bad guys, because I know they are. What the rest of us need to do is make sure that these folks have the resources to do their job. And there's plenty of blame to go around, but the way we absolve ourselves of that blame is to solve the problem. And that's what we have an opportunity to do, to solve the problem, to work together with people in the space, to partner with law enforcement, prosecutors, advocates, the healthcare community. We have a lot of brains, and we have an awful lot of people who are committed to doing the right thing here. And I think ultimately the process of going around and pointing the finger of blame at certain people is not productive. And it frankly doesn't do anything to repair the shattered lives of rape victims. The importance of this effort at the end of the day is that we can build a great monument to the victims of rape by building a better system to serve them.
Going on the scarcity,
Yeah.
the rape kits, we have a lot of those that haven't been tested. What about other items in the lab?
This is very important, because while I've got to be sensitive to mission creep in what I do, and that is we do limit the scope of investigation so we can focus precisely on that in which we intend to focus. But you would have to be a fool in our effort not to acknowledge that there has been a staggering increase in the need for forensic evidence. Folks, you know, a few years ago, a fingerprint might be all you needed in a burglary investigation. But now we see demands on the crime lab for up to that's resulted in a 35% increase in requests for forensic evidence. They're looking for forensic evidence in burglary investigations now. And this is because, and this isn't a bad thing, it's because the culture has changed. We have the CSI effect. People watch on television and go serve on juries and expect to see a forensic slam dunk in order to garner a guilty verdict. That's the world we're living in. And the world has changed from a fingerprint age to a digital age. And in doing so, we've got to make sure that we recognize that a fully funded crime lab is just as important as a number of beat cops on the street.
Has KSP done anything to clear up some of these communication problems?
Sure. I think KSP is, I want to say that KSP has worked well with us in identifying these problems and trying to get to an outcome that ultimately will benefit them. I mean, these are there are reforms that are incredibly important, but their work in winning the national award of $1.9 million is a big deal. It's demonstrative of a lot of steps in the right direction. The work group that they have convened to service that grant and to self-evaluate is something that's extraordinarily important. And I'm certainly not here to judge people who have been in this space for a long time. I'm just here to identify holes in the system where the process hasn't worked as efficiently as it ought to have, and to make recommendations for making it whole.
Do you know from KSP how many lab analysts there are? How many do they need?
There are currently about 20 analysts. Clearly, now there are some vacancies there, and that agency, just like every agency in state government, including the one you're in right now, sees a lot of turnover. And a big part of the problem is, Jack, is that while you're trying to, listen, you have to be a really credentialed person to work in a crime lab. And these are folks who have advanced biology degrees who are making $32,000 a year. And we're right across the river, they could make $45,000 to start. We have got to be more competitive, and we've got to understand in the digital age, fighting crime requires as much brain power as it does muscle.
The report showed that some of KSP's documents had advised local law enforcement against overloading the system. Do you think that local law enforcement is starting to get the message that I guess that's not worrisome? Well,
among the groups that are the most sensitive to the degree to which the state crime lab is overloaded with work are local law enforcement. And what the current system has done is it's put a culture in place where local law enforcement conducts a triage of evidence, just like everybody else is doing in a period of economic scarcity, where they're trying to make decisions about whether or not to send information to a crime lab that's already overburdened. So I think there are cases when there's evidence that probably in a perfect world definitely should have been sent on that weren't processed because they themselves didn't want to make it more difficult for the crime lab to do their job. So my point is, rather than forcing local and state law enforcement to triage, we ought to force the criminals to triage or get out of the business of being criminals altogether by having a fully resourced, fully staffed state crime lab.
According to your report, Louisville Metro Police had the most untested rape kits in evidence storage, and the second biggest city in Kentucky had none in storage. Do you believe that Louisville Metro Police are doing something to get all of those kits out of storage?
They are, and let me be clear about what's happening in Louisville. Louisville is still dealing with a conflict in policies and procedures that was pre-merger. So a big difference between Louisville and Lexington or Louisville and other large municipalities is Louisville, several years ago merged their government, and the county government had one process for handling these, and the city government had another. And during the merger, and after the merger, it really does take some time to reconcile those differing and unique sets of policies and procedures. So I think that's a big part of why Louisville is in the shape it's in, and not to mention it's by far the largest metropolitan area in the state.
Thanks.
All right, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.